evening. I'd like to say good job to all the younger guys who did stuff tonight. If you would start heading over to Daniel chapter 6, that's where the main part of our text is going to be tonight. But before I read that, I would like to ask you a question. Have you ever had someone hate you at work? Someone would just do anything to get rid of you? That's kind of what Daniel had happened to him in Daniel chapter 6. I'm going to break it into 3 sections, not read all 26 verses all at once. But the first section will be Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any charge against this Daniel, unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, "King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors, have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter." Therefore King Darius signed the written decree. In this reading, we find that Daniel was loved by the king of Persia, Darius. But we also read that Daniel was appointed governor of the Persian Empire, but his fellow governors hated him. They absolutely despised him. So these men decided to deceive the king Darius by convincing him to make a decree that forced people to serve no other god besides him. Now please turn over to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26, verses 59 through 64. Matthew 26, 59 through 64. We see a similar event in the New Testament where the chief priests and Pharisees lied to find a reason to murder Jesus. But Peter followed him at a distance, 59, my bad. Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at last 2 false witnesses came forward and said, "This fellow said, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days.' And the high priest arose and said to him, 'Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?' And Jesus kept silent, and the high priest answered and said to him, 'I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the living Christ, or the Christ, Son of God.' And Jesus said to him, 'It is as you say. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven.'" We see the chief priests and the Pharisees plotting against Jesus falsely to find a reason to kill him, but they cannot find a reason, just like the other governors couldn't find a reason to remove Daniel from his office. The other day, Mr. Kevin and I were talking about this lesson actually, and he mentioned that he knew a congregation one time that recently hired a youth minister. That youth minister began to want the preacher's job, so he started to go around in secret and spread false rumors about the preacher. No, this wasn't my dad and Mr. Kevin. But because of the preacher leading an upstanding and Christian life, the youth minister was exposed and fired. The second reading, if you go back to Daniel chapter 6, we find in verses 10 through 17. Verses 10 through 17. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? And the king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. And they answered and said before the king that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard to you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. And then these men approached the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying, Daniel, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Then a stone was brought and laid at the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, and with the signets of his lords. The purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. We now see Daniel's faith being tested. We see that when Daniel heard of the decree, he immediately went to his dwelling and prayed 3 times per day, or 3 times that day, as he had always done. The other governors and satraps found him one day praying, and immediately seized him and brought him to the king. The king was very disheartened because he loved Daniel, and he knew that he couldn't go back on his word. But he was more disheartened because he knew that what was going to happen to Daniel. He then sent for Daniel and had Daniel cast into the den of lions. He then called out for Daniel, Let your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. Now please go to Matthew chapter 27, verses 16 through 23. Matthew 27, verses 16 through 23. We also see in the life of Jesus, when he was surrounded by the crowd who despised him, they decided that they wanted him dead instead of Barabbas, a criminal. Verse 16. And at that time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ? For he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said to them, Which of the 2 do you want me to release? They said, Barabbas. Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said to him, "Let him be crucified." The governor said, "Why, what evil has he done?" And they all cried out more, saying, "Let him be crucified." When I was back in Missouri, I played basketball. The locker rooms of high school sports are filled with all sorts of trials and temptations. But when I played basketball, the locker room was filled with all sorts of peer pressures. Some include cursing, people wanting you to say those curse words, talking about drugs and other impurities, and wanting you to do those also. But I mentioned that not to toot my own horn and that I stayed away from those things, but rather to show how hard it is to be Christian-like in situations like that, even when your peers around you want you to not be Christian-like. Now, please go back to Daniel chapter 6, and we'll read verses 18 through 26. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den of lions and cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel, the king spoke, saying to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." Now the king was exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatsoever was found on him, because he believed in his God. And the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives, and the lions overpowered them, and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Then King Darius wrote to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in the earth, "Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end." We see at the beginning of these verses that the king was very upset, even to the point of refraining from food. But the next morning at daybreak, the king went immediately to the lion's den. When he drew near to it, he called to Daniel and found out Daniel was alive and unharmed. He found out later that God had sent an angel that shut the lion's mouth, and that is what protected Daniel. The men that accused him were then thrown into the den along with their families. The king then commanded all the people under him to fear and tremble before the Lord God of Israel. Now please head back over to Matthew, in Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 6. Matthew 28, 1 through 6. Now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to the tomb, and behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it. His countenance was like lightning, and his clothing was white as snow. And the guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men. But the angel answered and said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, and he has come. See the place where the Lord laid. And we also see, just like Daniel, in the life of Jesus, he was delivered from death in his resurrection. When I was about 11 or 12, my family and I went camping in the mountains of Colorado. Shortly after we arrived at the mountain we were staying on, my dad, sister, and cousin and I decided to go on a walk. We started heading back after about an hour of walking, but on the way back I was walking too close to the edge of a little ravine that had a creek on the bottom and rocks. Shortly after, the ground below me started to crumble, and I found myself hanging on to the edge of a sharp drop-off that at the bottom looked to be about 10 to 15 feet down, with rocks at the bottom. But luckily my dad was nearby, and he rushed over and pulled me up. So God, through my dad, saved me from serious injury or maybe even death. But in Daniel 6, we see that Daniel's faith is what saved him. Daniel was thrown into a lion's den, then saved by an angel, and then honored by the king. Daniel was saved because of his faith. He had faith in God even in the face of death, so God rewarded that faith and saved him from perishing. Now I'd like to ask 3 questions. Would you be able to continue to show your face even in the face of death? Would you have the faith to stand up against one of the most powerful people in the world and still be able to serve your God? And lastly, would you have the faith that even if you faced being thrown into a den of lions, that faith to still serve your God? Daniel had that courage and faith, that even when he was faced with being thrown into a den of lions, he still did as God commanded of him. If your faith is lacking, or if you need to show your faith in God by doing as he commands and becoming his child through baptism, we ask that you come forward now as we stand and sing.